You've been vocal for months about the need for the EU to add Hezbollah to their list of terrorist organizations, and recently the EU just made some progress on that point. Why do you feel like this is so important, and what would you like them to see? What would you like to see them do further?
Many of my friends think that the reason I've been spending so much time in Europe, meeting with officials and law enforcement and intelligence, foreign ministry, all those types, think tanks, students, talking about the need for a European Union designation of Hezbollah in whole or in part is simply because I had handed in the manuscript of the book to Georgetown and I needed something to do until the book came out. But in fact, this is something that is very, very important and I've been trying to get people's attention on for quite some time. One of the things that makes Hezbollah so powerful today is its ability to muddy the waters between its legitimate and its illegitimate activities. And de facto, what that has done for the group until recently, in Europe in particular, is buy the group a measure of protection, of invincibility, where people were wary of taking on Hezbollah, holding them accountable for clearly illicit conduct, whether it was criminal activity such as moving narcotics or counterfeiting European currency, whether it was actual terrorist operations like the attack in Burgas, Bulgaria, or the attempted attack in Cyprus a week earlier, or others like it, or logistical activities such as moving operatives from Lebanon through Europe and then into Israel to carry out attacks there with the logistical support of Hezbollah members or supporters in Europe, fearing that holding Hezbollah account for those types of activities would undermine stability in Lebanon, that because Hezbollah was a political actor, a social welfare service provider, duly elected political actor in Lebanon, you couldn't hold them accountable. By designating even just the military wing of Hezbollah, which is what the European Union just did, the EU has made it clear that there are lines that cannot be crossed, and that Hezbollah no longer gets a get-out-of-jail-free card for its illicit activities by virtue of also engaging in legitimate activities. And imagine if I left this interview and walked outside and robbed the first bank that I came across, and when arrested told the police, well, listen, I understand and I'll give back the money, but I'm involved in politics and I give charity. So it's an Alice in Wonderland way of looking at the world. And just from a rule of law, enforcing your own rules perspective, I felt that Europe had to do something. And then certainly once Hezbollah carried out the bombing in Burgas, Bulgaria, that, by any definition, crossed a Rubicon, crossed a threshold, and it had to be addressed. Hezbollah issued this challenge card to Europe. Was Europe going to respond or not? Failure to respond, I feared, would have emboldened Hezbollah to do more. By virtue of responding, however they responded, in this case by designating the military wing of Hezbollah, they've made it clear that there is a political consequence to Hezbollah's militant terrorist activities, and Hezbollah cares about its political standing. So the idea is to try and affect their calculus. Hezbollah is not Al-Qaeda. They're both terrorist groups, but Hezbollah is much more rational and calculating, and they care about grassroots support and public opinion within their community. There are ways to affect, maybe not their ideological position, I don't think you can change that, but certainly their calculus about what to do today or tomorrow. And that's part of why this is so important. It may not be that the European Union will be able to seize all that much money based on this action by virtue of only designating part of the group, so they'll just raise money under the rest of the group. But it will empower European countries to open preemptive intelligence investigations into Hezbollah, which very few European countries had been doing until now. And when I met with them, they said very clearly that the reason they weren't doing it was because Hezbollah was not yet designated as a terrorist group within the EU. So I think this could have some real ramifications.
So we've been talking about how the EU views Hezbollah, but what would you say are some of the misperceptions that people in the US have about the organization?
I think in the United States and generally in the West, frankly, people either see Hezbollah as a terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda that wants to carry out attacks at any turn, no matter what, that's not calculating, rational in the least. Or they see it as, they know it more as a political actor in Lebanon, and they're not aware of the fact that what makes Hezbollah so complicated to comprehend and then to deal with in terms of policies is the fact that it is a political party. It is a social welfare provider, it is a militia, it is a transnational organized criminal group, and it is an international terrorist organization. It's not one or the other. You cannot simply expect that if you engage with them, you can moderate them. That doesn't take into account their ideological grounding and their close ties to Iran. As one Hezbollah put it, and I quote him in the book, if you don't appreciate our sincere commitment to waliyat al-faqih, the Iranian concept of the rule of the jurisprudent, the idea that the supreme leader in Iran is the mouthpiece of God on earth, then you don't understand who we are. You don't have to agree with it, you don't have to think it's right, but if you don't understand that, you don't understand us. And so the book is trying to explain Hezbollah as all these things at once. If you don't understand that, you can't understand why it would be that Hezbollah would blow up a busload of Israeli civilians in Bulgaria when it's under so much pressure in Lebanon. Why, perhaps, Hezbollah assassinated the former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rafik Hariri. Four Hezbollah operatives, one very senior one, have been charged with the crime by a UN tribunal meeting in The Hague. Why Hezbollah would go and do what it's doing in Syria, again, at a time when it's under tremendous pressure in Lebanon, and every day that it's in Syria, it comes under more political pressure in Lebanon. Why it would go and send an entire unit of people to Iraq during the Iraq War. Because it has multiple identities. And those identities and their priorities shift over time. Right now, the U.S. intelligence community assesses, the Director of National Intelligence and the Director of the National Counterterrorism Center both have said this publicly, that today the U.S. intelligence community assesses Iran's relationship with Hezbollah as a strategic partnership, with Iran as the primary partner. So some of the acts of international terrorism we're seeing today have to do with the Hezbollah trying to avenge the death of Imad Bugnia, its arch-terrorist who was killed in Damascus in February 2008. But others, like the bombings and attempted bombings of Israeli tourists around the world, are very clearly tied not to the efforts to avenge Mugnia's death, but to Iran's interest in exacting a cost on the West, including Israel, the United States, the UK, others, Saudis, for the various things that are going on to try and stop Iran's nuclear program.
Going forward, how do you believe the global community should deal with Hezbollah in order to try to keep them in check?
I think that the international community has to make it clear to Hezbollah that certain activities are just beyond the pale. No questions asked. International criminal activity, international terrorism support activity, logistics, fundraising, etc., completely beyond the pale. I don't think Hezbollah would, but theoretically, if Hezbollah were to drop those activities, remain a political, social group deeply, deeply committed to the destruction of Israel and other things that many of us would not feel comfortable with, that would be one thing. There are lots of political parties out there that you might not agree with, but if so long as they engage in politics to pursue their agenda, that's one thing. It's when one engages in criminal, terrorist, militant activities to pursue one's agenda that one crosses a Rubicon in the world of international, certainly Western democracies. Is Hezbollah capable of doing that? I don't think so. I would love to be proved wrong. One way to force a deciding moment and find out is to demonstrate, as the European Union just recently did, that we will absolutely hold Hezbollah accountable for its illicit conduct. There will be no immunity for Hezbollah from investigations into its terrorist and fundraising and other illicit activities, simply because it is also a political actor in Lebanon and provides social welfare support in Lebanon. And let's see if it can make that split. I don't think it's capable of doing it. I think that the evidence we put forward in the book makes that clear. And let me make clear, it's not that I started in that position and then found evidence to support it, quite the opposite. I think that as the process of researching and writing this book, it just became clearer and clearer and clearer that Hezbollah's ties with Iran are the defining characteristic for the group that trump all others. Not that it doesn't have other characteristics or identities, it does, but this is the one that is the foundation for all the rest.